there are a lot of children who are often labelled as, having problems with attending school. And there's this idea of kind of emotion-based school avoidance. And it might be that we're actually missing a massive trick and not supporting these children because their brain and body together are making things difficult. So it could be that they have feeling dizzy, they could be feeling lightheaded, they could be having gut problems, but also all of the focus, attention problems, the social problems, the emotional problems that go with neurodivergence like ADHD and autism, and that we need to look at the whole child together and not just make assumptions, they don't want to go to school or they're trying to get out of school, and put in sensory sensitivities and things on top of all of that, work out for each child how best to support them.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews, inspiring special guest stories, and parents sharing their real-life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire Quigley-Ward, and today we're talking about ADHD and hypermobility with Dr Jessica Eccles, an award-winning researcher and neurodevelopmental psychiatrist who specialises in the link between the brain and the body. Jessica is an associate professor in brain-body medicine at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. She works within the Sussex NHS Neurodevelopmental Service, supporting people with ADHD, autism and Tourette syndrome, where she co-founded the world's first neurodivergent brain-body clinic and has spent over 17 years researching the intersection between hypermobility and neurodivergence. In this episode, we explore what hypermobility actually is, how it can show up in children, and what we know about the overlap with ADHD, and how the connection between the brain and the body might help us better understand some of our children. Welcome aboard, Jessica.
Thank you, Claire. It's wonderful to be all aboard.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So when we talk about hypermobility, what is it we're actually describing beyond being very flexible?
I think that's the thing, is hypermobility, which literally joint hypermobility means having joints that move, an extended range, is actually a red herring. So joint hypermobility is, it can mean that you have fingers that bend backwards. It means that you can maybe do party tricks. But what it is actually is a clue to an underlying difference in how the body is built. So we are built with collagen, with connective tissue. This is everywhere in the body. And because it's everywhere in the body, it doesn't just mean that it affects the joints. So if you are maybe someone who did party tricks or you have flexible joints, it may mean that the connective tissue inside you is different. So if we think about this, the gut is a really good example. So if you have different type of connective tissue, it means your gut might move more slowly or more quickly, which may mean that you are more prone to diarrhea or constipation or feeling full. But if you did a camera test to look at the insides of the gut, you wouldn't necessarily see that. You wouldn't see it under the microscope, but the gut moves differently. So joint hypermobility is in some ways a clue to something that's going on in the body. And so it's not just the guts that are affected, it's the veins, which affects how easily blood returns to the heart. It's tissue in the lungs. So there's a link between hypermobility and asthma, for example. It's the skin. So people may scar in a particular way, like thin, papery scarring. They may have difficulty with wound healing. They may bruise easily. But the markers are really the things that people spot are the joints. So one of the things that children often manifest that suggests that there is an underlying joint hypermobility is sitting in the W position. Are you familiar with the W position, Claire?
No, I was trying to picture that when you said W.
So the W position, some of us may remember Britney Spears had an album when she was an adult in which she sat in the W position on the front of the album. And the W position is one indicator of hypermobility. Another is doing what I'm just about to do, which is where you put your hands behind your back in a reverse yoga pose.
Where you can pray.
Do you see? Yeah, like a reverse prayer pose. And
trying it here.
Trying it there, and then sort of having elbows that bend backwards. Do you see how my my elbow? So you have to, like that. No, so you have to keep your palms facing upwards. So a bit like that. I don't think it's hard to tell because your sweatshirt's in the way.
Yes.
But it's where instead of having the kind of a sort of natural bend, it goes downwards. How I got picked up as being hypermobile was at medical school. I was on a ward round and someone said to me, "You have sway back knees. Come and see me in clinic." So the normal knee is kind of, this is it's kind of slightly like that, but in a sway back knee, you can actually see them kind of a bit banana-y in profile. So lots of children actually seem to be hypermobile, and then they stiffen up a little. And there isn't an awful lot of good research, but we know from something called the Auspat birth cohort, which is all of the children born in Bristol and Avon in the early 1990s, that probably, not probably, we know equivocally that about 10% of boys and about 30% of girls around the age of 14 or 15 have a certain number of flexible joints. And we did research that suggested those who had flexible joints were more likely to go on and develop anxiety and depression.
Wow.
And we know that in neurodivergent conditions like ADHD and autism, particularly for children, for adults across the lifespan, anxiety is a really difficult co-occurrence. And you can see how anxiety and neurodivergence, so ADHD and autism, can sort of collide, especially with physical health problems that children might have, funny tummies, growing pains. That's another sign of hypermobility often, might combine to make it harder to go to school, and I have a colleague, I'm a patron of a charity called SEDS Connective, which is chaired by Jane Green, who got into the whole hypermobility neurodivergent space through her experiences in education. And so there are a lot of children who are often labelled as, having problems with attending school. And there's this idea of kind of emotion-based school avoidance. And it might be that we're actually missing a massive trick and not supporting these children because their brain and body together are making things difficult. So it could be that they have, feeling dizzy. They could be feeling lightheaded. They could be having gut problems, but also all of the focus, attention problems, the social problems, the emotional problems that go with neurodivergence like ADHD and autism, and that we need to look at the whole child together and not just make assumptions, they don't want to go to school, or they're too lazy, or they're trying to get out of school, and work out how, and you put in sensory sensitivities and things on top of all of that, work out for each child how best to support them.
That might possibly be the most interesting answer to an opening question I have had on this podcast yet. Genuinely fascinating. And I've got so many follow-up questions, so I'm going to try and break them down.
Yeah.
But firstly, I didn't know even what you were saying about the gut. I didn't know that. That's really, really interesting to me. I just thought it was a joint thing and a flexibility thing. And I just wanted to start by picking up on the clues bit, because I thought that's a good place to start for parents. So you sort of mentioned the W position, or the leg.
The sway back knees. Yeah, the sway
slightly
back
bends
knees.
backwards was my understanding of it. That jumped out at me because I noticed my daughter came to a gym session with me over the school holidays, and she never stays still. So I'd never really paid attention to this, but she was doing something with me and I was stood at the side watching her, and I noticed for the first time a slight backward bend in her knee, and I'd never seen that before. So I was like, So yes, that triggered a thought for me there. But other than those, especially I'm thinking with young children who maybe, can't really articulate any of this stuff yet, what are those clues that parents should look out for beyond the obvious?
This is the fascinating thing. So ADHD and autism and hypermobility, although we're really unsure of all of the complicated genetics, it's clear that this is often as heritable as height. And we have to actually go further back than the child to think about hypermobility. So we know, and I'm sure my mother wouldn't mind using me as an example. I am hypermobile. I told you about being picked up at medical school because I had sway back knees. I also had terrible problems at medical school and for a long period of my life because I had a condition which often people talk about in terms of clicky hips. So it wasn't picked up until I was about 9 months old, but I had what is now known as developmental dysplasia of the hip. I didn't have a properly formed hip socket on my left side. And
I'm so excited. Sorry. I'm trying not to interrupt you, that ADHD impulsivity. No. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But keep going.
So I had this problem, congenital dislocation of the hip, developmental dysplasia, and now I'm having problems with my right hip. But developmental dysplasia of the hip, I remember going to a lecture series organised by Rodney Graham, who's the grandfather of hypermobility. Some studies, actually congenital dislocation of the hip was one of the very first things that was written about in the literature back in the 60s or 70s as being associated with hypermobility. So there is a high possibility if you or your child had clicky hips or clicky hips was a thing that they might be hypermobile. My mother is hypermobile, and you can catch my mother on Bendy Brain episode 5, where I interview her about her late diagnosis of ADHD at 72, and also on BBC's Archive Hour, the history of ADHD, trouble staying still. We interview my mother as part of that too. So my mother,
very cool.
I was born prematurely, and we now know, we didn't know back then in 1982 when I was born at 30 weeks, that premature rupture of membranes, which is where your waters break early, which had happened to her some weeks before I was born, is known to be associated with hypermobility. I also had, as a child, something called an inguinal hernia. You often think about old men and hernias, but hernias are part of the diagnostic criteria for hypermobility. So there were already there 3 clues that I could be hypermobile and could be neurodivergent before I was even a year old. So the prematurity, which the literature suggests that prematurity is a risk for ADHD and autism, but you have to think about it and go backwards. Am I autistic, have ADHD because I was premature, or was it because my mother is hypermobile and ADHD that I am actually hypermobile and neurodivergent? The pregnancy complications could have been not a red herring, they're a clue, but it wasn't, I don't think it was being premature that was necessarily, cause and effect. So when I went to university, my mother was very worried when I was born that everyone told her I'd probably be brain damaged and all of this sort of stuff, because this was back in the 80s with, special care baby units and everything. And there is a genuine fear. But when I was at university, I remember meeting for the first time 2 other people who were also both born at 30 weeks. And we all had the same, mine's a bit different now, but it's a bit like yours, long, thin face.
Ooh.
And a long, thin face often goes with having hypermobility, as does having, can you see how I've got quite narrow wrists?
Yes.
What I'm doing here is I'm overlapping my thumb and my thumb and my little finger. Yes, you can do that. We'll have to have a chat about that. And then do you see here, putting my thumb the other side of my palm? So you take your thumb and you see, can you make your thumbnail protrude all of the way beyond your hand? No, so you can't.
Well, just more so.
You want the whole nail, nail. So you have one of these signs, the Walker sign, which is you're almost there, but then there's this thumb sign. So these are markers of having it's something called arachnodactyly, which literally means long, spidery digits. So I don't know, Claire, do you have long, thin toes? I'm not asking you to take your socks off on air, but has anyone ever said you've got long, thin toes?
No, I don't actually, but I have got very thin fingers.
Yes. So if people think, oh, I've got piano player's fingers or guitar player's fingers, this is all part of the sign. It's not essential to have that type of fingers and wrists. But my mother has a picture of her great aunt. So if we manage to think back in time to whenever my mother, who was born in 1949, her mother born in 1918, I think. So her mother's aunt, so even older, we have this picture of her. She was used in a cigarette advert, and she has exactly the same wrists. And I've posted about it on Instagram, but this idea of a kind of drape posture, where you are you look a bit gangly and a bit languid, sort of leaning forward, eating with your elbows on the table because you're literally holding yourself up.
Oh, I'm doing now. I mean, I'm not eating,
yes,
but elbows
exactly.
on the table.
I can see that. So these are all soft signs that you might be hypermobile. And I'll make sure in the notes on the show that we link to the toolkit to talk about your hypermobility with your GP, because they are just basically markers of underlying connective tissue differences. And the thumbs and the finger things that I talked about, they should prompt medical evaluation. But the other thing that hypermobile children often have as a consequence of their hypermobility is frequent ankle sprains. So, and also, you're talking about your daughter with her sway back knees that you noticed in the gym. For a hypermobile person, if that actually seems like a natural position, but it's not really a particularly natural position. And it means then that you may find that it's actually quite hard to stand up for long periods. And it could be hard to stand up for long periods for a couple of reasons. One is that your knees are in overextension. The other is that there is a condition associated with hypermobility. So I talked about how this connective tissue is everywhere. Well, it's in the vessels. And if you have looser vessels, if you're standing for a long time, your vessels are not, and the connective tissue around it and the muscles and things are not helping necessarily the blood get back up to the heart. It's against gravity. And what can then happen is the brain and the body are desperately trying to keep everything under control, but you are having less blood come back to the heart. So what has to happen from a very basic physiology perspective is you raise your heart rate. And so that can make you feel lightheaded, palpitations. We're doing a study at the moment in adults where we've mimicked going from lying to standing in the brain scanner, and we've shown that it induces brain fog. So there are two reasons why a neurodivergent brain body might struggle to stand for long periods, like in assembly or church or in a queue, is that not only is it actually quite taxing, or if you were standing, with your knees back as a way of standing up, but you also might be beginning to feel dizzy and light-headed. And there are lots and lots of things that you can do to help with that. So, Pilates and core strength can help with stability and strengthening, but also making sure that, for example, something quite simple like electrolytes, that you have them before you're going to stand up for a long time. So if you know that you are, you're a big fan of the latest thing and you're going to go to a shop and queue for 3 hours and you have to stand up, have an electrolyte drink before you have to stand up or take a little stool along. So this whole problem with the blood pooling, and you can see it sometimes in people's feet, is that the same thing happens if you have a large meal for some people, or if you go in a hot environment, like have a hot shower or a very hot bath. So one of the things I ask my patients is, do you often is the operative word, not just occasionally, do you often feel like you might have to lie down if you have a hot bath? And many of them say, Yes, actually, I avoid baths. And this is all to do with this difference in the something called the autonomic nervous system, which is the involuntary nervous system that is highly associated with hypermobility, called postural tachycardia syndrome. And there are some excellent resources on, even if you didn't get a diagnosis, and the diagnostic criteria are different in young people, is things like electrolytes. You mentioned that your daughter keeps moving, or I mean, that's part maybe of ADHD, I don't know, but also it's a way of keeping the muscles working and helping the blood get back up. So there are specific calf exercises that can really help boost the blood back up to the heart. And then the same thing is, and you can get quite snazzy things now. Sometimes people find that really tight compression garments, a bit like very tight leggings, they also help with that. But you can see, Claire, how I started the conversation about how neurodivergent hypermobile children could struggle at school. They can also do really well at school for a number of reasons, but they may really struggle with things like standing in assembly and forget about the fact about, getting distracted and difficulty, but they could be struggling not only with focus and distractibility, which is probably also related to blood flow and attention. They could be actually physically struggling as well.
Yeah, gosh, so interesting. I mean, to begin with, then, when you were talking about the hip thing, I was trying so hard not to interrupt, but I was so excited because weirdly, I've never thought for a second that I was hypermobile because I'm not flexible. I'd love to be able to do the splits. Yeah, I know.
The splits, this is different level of flexibility. The splits is not a prerequisite. You do not need to be able to do the splits. And what it is a lot of people come from quite flexible families and they've got family members who can, touch their ears with their toes or something. So they're thinking, I'm stiff as a board. I am so not flexible, but actually they are. The other thing is in the self-report questionnaire, which is for adults, it's can you now or could you ever put your hands flat on the floor without bending your knees? Now, I can't do that because of all my hip problems and, my hamstrings. Anyway, but the other one is, were you ever able to bend your thumb back to touch your forearm? It looks like you almost can, and you probably could. So the self-report questionnaire is, can you now or could you ever? And then there is this one, this is for adults, this is not validated in children. There is the question, when you were a child or teenager, did you amuse your friends? Now, this is where some of my neurodivergent patients take this literally and say, well, I didn't amuse my friends. I didn't have any friends. Could you contort your body into strange shapes or do the splits? So some people, it's like they can do really weird things with their fingers, kind of overlap them and things. So, but doing the splits is not a requirement. And then as a child or teenager, did your shoulder or kneecap dislocate on more than one occasion? So people with hypermobility, not all people with hypermobility, are prone to joints coming out of socket or nearly coming out of socket. And one of the things I talk about in my neurodivergent brain body clinic is, how do people feel carrying shopping? Now, you think to yourself, just carrying shopping. But a lot of people, hypermobile people, actually really struggle. They think that and this can happen to me, that their shoulders are almost going to come out of socket by carrying heavy bags.
That pulling sensation, yeah.
Yes, that pulling sensation. And this is not typical of only light shopping. The other thing is, I was talking to a patient the other day, adult, and I said, how would you feel if I asked you to lift up a Le Creuset saucepan? Now, Le Creuset is a French brand of cooking, but it's known to be incredibly heavy cast iron. And there's this sort of feeling that your wrists might not actually support lifting up such heavy kitchenware. My brother gave me an absolutely delightful blue Le Creuset griddle pan, and I unfortunately, I use the Aldi one instead because it's much lighter. And if you, Le Creuset, that's like, cooking and adults, but children, if they find that writing is actually, you kind of get wrist strain, that's a sign. I used to play, I wasn't very good at it, the violin, and I had outrageous difficulties holding my violin bow correctly because my fingers sort of kind of like that.
I'm thinking about pen grip at school.
Yeah, pen grip. musical instruments. And the other thing that I'm sure is to do with my hypermobile fingers and the fact that I am almost certainly dyspraxic and have some form of developmental coordination disorder is that I cannot for the life of me use chopsticks. It's just too complicated. And that's partly to do with coordination, but it's also partly to do with the way my fingers just collapse. And if you think about it, this could cause some genuine problems for children at school in terms of writing. And it may be that they get, told off for having, for avoiding writing or for struggling with writing. The other thing is we know, I know you're all about ADHD, all aboard about ADHD, but these neurodivergent things, they all come together. And we know that probably ADHD and autism co-occur almost as frequently as they are singular. The other thing that crops up loads and is dyslexia and dyscalculia. So are you able, did you struggle to learn to ride a bike, to tie your shoelaces? Do you only wear shoes that don't have laces? How are you with a knife and fork? And then, how are you learning to drive? I, for example, my brother learned to drive very quickly. I did not. My poor father came with me most days for almost a year as I drove to school. That was like 15 miles away. I had 30 lessons. I failed my test the first time, passed it the second time. But the interesting thing was both my violin teacher and my driving instructor said to me, Jess, do you think you're dyslexic? Now, I was known for being quite clever and quite good at writing. And I was like, don't think I'm dyslexic. But what they had identified is there was something different about me. And what they were describing actually was dyslexia, and they might have also been describing ADHD because I was always leaving my violin places and I could never coordinate. This is more like dyspraxia. When everyone else's bow was going in one direction, mine was going in the other. They had realized that there was something slightly different about me, but the only vocabulary they had for that at that time in the late 90s was dyslexia. And so that was them both saying, we think there's something slightly different about you. We think you might have dyslexia. I think it's one of the few neurodivergences that I don't actually have. But you can see how this all collides. And I suppose I should say, because I've been talking all about hypermobility and how you could spot it and all of these things and dyspraxia, is that we know from research that we did at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, and it was the first in the world to ever link these concepts, was that hypermobility is more common in neurodivergent people, so ADHD, autism, Tourette's. No one had looked at it as a group before. They'd either looked in ADHD or autism. And we also showed that relationship, and this is at the, we talk about it a lot on our Bendy Brain YouTube channel, but it's also in my link tree. The seminal paper was published in Frontiers. We showed that this combination, the neurodivergent patients were more likely to experience pain and more likeliness to experience dizziness and strange feelings towards standing up. And that relationship between being neurodivergent and having physical health problems was in fact explained by hypermobility. So this is why I'm talking to you about hypermobility, is because we know that there is such a tight link between neurodivergence and hypermobility. It seems, particularly from the data that we did, nearly 70% of our female ADHD and autism patients were hypermobile.
Wow, 70% did you say?
70%.
Wow.
And in my clinical practice, that was just using one research tool. In my clinical practice, I think that number is higher. I barely see any patients. I see adults who don't have some form of hypermobility related issue, and most of them have some form of problems with pain and fatigue. So we did two really interesting pieces of research about this with my colleague, my dear colleague, fantastic colleague, Dr. Lisa Quat at Brighton and Sussex Medical School. We showed in this Alspach birth cohort with all of these thousands and thousands of children, that if you had ADHD characteristics and autistic characteristics when you were between the ages of kind of 7 and 9, you had higher levels of inflammation in the blood, a marker called IL-6 at 9. Those children seem to have higher levels of inflammation. And being neurodivergent, having those neurodivergent characteristics at that age predicted subsequently being more likely to experience disabling fatigue at 18. So, and that was published, that's on my link tree. I think it was published in BMJ Open. So that is this whole brain-body link between the neurodivergent characteristics, the inflammation, and the subsequent fatigue. Now, there's a lot of interest or, controversy about conditions like fibromyalgia and ME/CFS, which are again things that can affect particularly teenagers and lead to troubles at school. And often at the same time, these same teenagers are struggling to get on a list or be seen for ADHD and autism assessments, trying to get these physical health things even harder than trying to get the ADHD and autism diagnoses. And we published only a few weeks ago that we found adults, mainly women, with chronic pain and fatigue diagnoses, and we found that their neurodivergent characteristics predicted the presence of chronic fatigue and chronic pain, but because of hypermobility. So I think it's this massive combination of thinking styles, autonomic differences, inflammatory differences, and they predispose to experiencing pain and fatigue. And we showed as well twice, and we're about to publish again, that if you are hypermobile, you're more likely to not recover from COVID, so to develop long COVID. And that's been a real problem for some children, not getting the help that they need for having long COVID.
My gosh, so interesting.
Sorry,
because no, honestly, I'm captivated by what you're saying. I'll just go back ever so slightly because the hip thing, firstly, I was born, again, never thought I was hypermobile, without a fully formed left hip socket. So I wore a splint for the first 6.
Often left.
Interesting.
Yes.
Like love yoga, but after maybe 12 years of doing it, no further in things like lizard and pigeon because my hips are so tight. But that was definitely there for me present. And then I was thinking about my son, what you were saying about compression and ankles. He rolls his ankle all the time, doesn't hurt him, rolls it, but loves compression socks. And I've always thought they're expensive. I've always thought, do we really need to be wearing these? And now I'm thinking,
have to be careful about allergies, because sometimes people are very sensitive. So you might want to get them in bamboo or cotton rather than the itchy stuff.
Interesting.
Yes, exactly.
And all of these links. And so basically kind of what you're saying is that it's not
a whole
really...
body thing. It's a whole body thing, and it's all connected, and I think it explains an awful lot. But when we are thinking about children who have an ADHD diagnosis or ADHD is being queried, we have to think so much more than inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity. This is vast.
It is vast, and it's really interesting because I agree with you, and both my children have got ADHD and they both have a holistic psychiatrist. So he tries to take a whole person approach, which does include the gut, but actually hypermobility and those elements you're talking about have never really been part of the conversation. But it's an interesting one because you said then obviously that about 70% of, was it girls and women?
These are adult women with ADHD or autism diagnoses, hypermobile.
Is that the same the other way around? So, for example, because I know that this differs slightly, say, with the ADHD autism, depending on which is the dominant diagnosis, it changes the likelihood. But how often do you see people who are hypermobile who are not neurodivergent, or is it so intertwined, like you said, brain and body, that's unlikely? I
would love to give you a definitive research answer. And there have been studies looking the other way. So I'm pretty sure Carolina Bieza-Valeska and maybe Emily Casanova have looked into this. The signal is I think pretty similar, but the problem is most research studies rely on people already having a diagnosis. And if you say interrogate GP records, that relies on there being a diagnosis. So systematically evaluating things is very difficult. The other problem, and Jane Green from SEDS Connective has a brilliant graphic about it that we talked about, something called alphabet soup. Hypermobility is a really complicated phenomenon in that it means different things to different people. And it has loads of different acronyms and labels, and they're changing all the time. It's quite a controversial space in children, and there are recommendations about different diagnostic criteria in children. But essentially, you have the presence of joint hypermobility, which may or may not be causing too many troubles. So we might talk about that as generalized joint hypermobility or generalized joint laxity. And that can be measured. That was measured in all the children in the ALSPAT birth cohort when they were 14 or 15. But then you can have problems with it. So we call that I call that, and other people call that, symptomatic hypermobility. But you might get a diagnostic label. You might get currently a diagnostic label of something called hypermobility spectrum disorder or hypermobile EDS. Now, if you watch Bendy Brain episode 2, you will see me talk about that. I think also a bit more in episode 1. So all people who have this condition, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, they are hypermobile, but not all people who have hypermobility have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So there are so many terms flying around. There's like EDS3, EDHST, JHS, BJHS. It is a nightmare. And I think it means that it's also not well taught in medical school that it's perfectly possible to encounter a doctor who maybe knows a little bit about hypermobility, that the Bateman scale, but they're not necessarily sure about the rest of it. So there is a really good, my colleague, Dr. Emma Reinhold, who was a GP, she wrote the EDS GP Toolkit, which is available online and is an excellent resource, particularly for showing your GP and talking about the things that seem to happen quite commonly with hypermobility. So the problem I was talking about, postural tachycardia syndrome, the dizziness on standing, large meals, having a hot shower. And then there is also, and this is a much more controversial field, but there is clearly a pattern, is problems with reactivity and allergies and histamine. And so feeling sick with smelling certain perfumes, reacting to washing powders, things not coming up on allergy tests. I'm loath to use my mother as a constant example, but she has something called oral allergy syndrome. And I have had a wave of patients recently with both oral allergy syndrome and something called cold urticaria. So oral allergy syndrome is where certain raw fruits and foods make your mouth tingle and sometimes make you feel like your throat is closing up. It's quite a scary thing, but it does not come on when you were very small. It's not like, I don't know, a peanut allergy or, I don't know, a different type of allergy. It tends to come on a little bit later in life. My mother first developed it to a rocket, the lettuce, in her 40s, and she loves making rocket, growing rocket, eating rocket. And it took her a long time to step back and say, no, I can't eat this because it's making my lips so tingly. And I see so many patients, and big culprits are things like pineapple, raw tomato, raw carrot, kiwi. And so this clustering of the problems with the inflammatory and the immune system, this clustering with problems with the involuntary nervous system, and then all of the physical and mental health problems, they're all colliding.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why it's so satisfying in some ways for me working in the field is obviously we've only been talking, I don't know now, for about 40 minutes, but maybe 8 things I've said, you're just like, wow, this is not just me, but this is like my family. And
thinking about my mum when you were saying all the allergy stuff. I mean, I have that oral thing, but suddenly.
And obviously you've got to go and seek appropriate medical advice. But all of these things are connected. And for someone who thinks, oh my, I've got all of these independent problems, I'm falling apart, no one understands, to realize that they may all be interconnected and that you don't necessarily have, 15 unrelated issues. They're actually all because you were built differently, think differently because of this variant in connective tissue. And it was fascinating. I was giving a talk recently about patterns and detecting patterns, because I think this is a beautiful pattern. And I thought to myself, who are some of our most favorite fictional detectives and pattern spotters? And so what came to my mind was Sherlock Holmes. And I thought, let's have a look and see how Conan Doyle described Sherlock Holmes in the actual books. And you know what? He had a long, thin face. He had long, thin fingers. He had soft skin. That's another thing, soft, stretchy skin. I like to stroke the back of my father's ears because he has such lovely soft skin on the back of his ears. There is this entire physicality. And then it talks about Sherlock Holmes going through all of these waves of torpor and exhaustion and, having some problems with cocaine and also, his 3-pipe problem, stimulants to get
tick,
through a tricky
tick,
problem.
tick,
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 tick, tick,
tick.
tick. And I was, this is a pattern that was howling in the bones of the face and fingers of Victorian fiction. I mean, somehow Conan Doyle just, commandeered Sherlock Holmes, and he ended up being a pattern spotter, but also having all of these physical things. And we have to be wary because, there is a very nasty history of eugenics and of, people being, not quite, yes, euthanized and experimented on and all sorts of things because of physical characteristics. We have to be so careful of that. But we also, you see on Instagram this idea of, you don't look ADHD or you don't look autistic. And I have to say, sometimes there are some clues. Even when they say that, they mean you're not behaving as I expect an autistic or an ADHD person to behave. But there are all these little things like the ADHD walk, this kind of idea of slightly veering off or into your walking companion. There is the way people, cross their legs. You can't see my legs because they're under the table. But I remember first meeting Hugo Critchley, who's been such a wonderful and amazing mentor and influence in my life, and sitting in his office and him commenting on how I kind of crossed over my legs twice. And he said, I wonder if you're doing, wrap it around, but more than one.
In fact, I'm doing it now.
Yes. And he said, I wonder if you're actually boosting your blood pressure.
So I've got low blood pressure. Is that a thing?
Yeah, it does seem to be associated. No. But, and I think that when we talk about ADHD, without considering these broader things, the other neurodivergences, the physical health stuff, we are absolutely missing a trick.
So much. Particularly with kids, I'm thinking, as you said, and I kind of want to dig into that a bit more. I thought maybe we could just go back a little bit to the stuff you were saying about nervous system, because that I think is really interesting. And particularly I'm thinking about how, because I'm also an ADHD coach, lots of the kids I coach can struggle with really being able to understand the feelings that they're having inside their body, or like you said, maybe how they are physically in a space.
Yeah, and uncertainty about where you are in space. Yes.
So is that something that can be related to hypermobility?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. So we're just about to, your podcast is probably going to go out after, but we're going to release a couple of episodes of Bendy Brain on anxiety and emotion regulation and strategies for thinking about emotion regulation. And some of this is very much rooted in the idea that hypermobile neurodivergent people, they have a trigger-happy nervous system. So it's far more reactive.
Yeah.
You're not entirely sure why it's reactive. So that feels uncertain and creates anxiety. And hypermobile neurodivergent people seem to be particularly prone to this idea of alexithymia, which I think is a great word. It's one of the reasons why I went into psychiatry. There are so many lovely words. But alexithymia literally means without the words for emotion or without the words for mood, alexithymus. But what it actually means is difficulty recognizing emotion. So for a lot of neurodivergent and hypermobile people, something may feel really horrible or it may feel very good, but distinguishing emotion is hard. Reading emotion in yourself, reading emotion in others, all a bit tricky. And then the other thing is this difference, and we're really going to dive into this in these episodes of Bendy Brain, is this sense of the inner sense of what's happening in your body. And we know that hypermobile neurodivergent people seem to have some difficulties with that. That's called interoception. And we know sometimes that you may only realize that you're hungry when you're really hungry, or that you need to pee when you really need to pee. So about having check-ins to remember to eat, to remember to pee, to remember to hydrate. But these are all part and parcel of the neurodivergent experience, and understanding that and how that interlinks with things like sensory sensitivities and emotion regulation, so important. And I have to say, you're not really supposed to have favorites in terms of your own papers and things, but one of the papers that I really love, because I think it opens up something cool for the future, this is in adults. We looked at neurodivergent characteristics and saw that they predicted emotion regulation problems, difficulties regulating your emotions, and that relationship was partially explained by a sense of uncertainty about where you are in space, this idea of proprioception. So not only that, so your uncertainty about where you are in space, and we know hypermobile people are more likely to experience that, and we've shown bits of brain that explain that your moods and feelings could actually be related to your stability, your physical stability. And then we show that relationship twice as strong in people who had flexible joints. So why this is, I think, groundbreaking, for want of a better word, is that actually, as well as thinking about ADHD medicine, as well as thinking about, coaching and psychotherapy, that actually these physical things could be super helpful as well. And for some people, especially if you're alexithymic, neurodivergent, prone to dissociation, traumatized, all of these things all go together. Actually talking about your feelings or being in a place to, like you do with coaching, to actually, think about what are the practical next steps. If you are feeling dysregulated, how to get into that zone where you can actually benefit from that one-on-one talking and brainstorming and thinking. You have to make sure that, it's often a physical thing or a sensory thing that will help get you into that window of tolerance.
Yeah, what do you need to do to get yourself there? I think it's such an important point, particularly when we know that ADHD is so highly environmental. And actually, maybe we're almost not thinking big enough in terms of what it being environmental means, because it's not just the environment that we are in, but how we are in that environment, how we physically are. It's so interesting. And I was thinking then about what you were saying in terms of the window of tolerance, like being able to use tools like coaching or psychotherapy, all of these things to support you in that. Because one of the things I've really recognized in my work is the link between impulsive behaviors, and you were talking about emotional regulation, and realizing that actually, and I use an analogy with the kids, a volcano, the impulsive action of the behavior is just the lava spilling out of the top.
But there's all this stuff
what
underneath.
We have to do is really come back. And I think it just takes such a long time to be able to do this, particularly with children and young people, to what's going on inside us. Often we seem so unaware of those things that the behaviour or the impulse that is sadly often followed with the consequences in the school environment.
But you could track it back.
We could track it back, and it's starting there.
Yeah, no. And it's also, it's about different people are different at different parts of their life, and we're all unique, and it's all going to be slightly different, but it's kind of trying to tune into the body to better regulate your emotions.
Yeah. And I'm thinking particularly about school, because I want to pick up on that, because you talked about that right at the beginning. And I think it's such an important point, because what you're saying is actually being both neurodivergent and hypermobile is going to make what is perhaps already a challenging environment like school even harder. And I just wondered if maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that's going to be really important for parents listening, thinking about how they can support their children.
Exactly. And this is where I would really guide people to SEDS Connective. So this is Jane Green's organisation, and they have a lot of resources. And Jane has written with some colleagues some papers about how to support young people in pain and at school. There is something called the EDS School Toolkit, but it's a little, it probably needs updating. But I would really, this is the problem, is we need to join up all these different bits, science, health, education, and Jane is really trying to do that with SEDS Connective. So I would definitely point people towards that resource, and we can put it in the show notes. But it is, I think I must acknowledge that it is a real struggle for a lot of people to get their children the support that they need, even with or without diagnoses. I mean, technically, legally, you don't need a diagnosis. You just need to evidence the impact and the functional difficulties. But it's so hard to get these diagnoses. And one of the sad things is I have a national role in neurodivergence. I chair the Royal College of Psychiatry's Neurodevelopmental Psychiatry Special Interest Group, massive mouthful. And I know, for example, last year there were 750,000 people in England, so a town the size of Manchester, waiting for ADHD and autism diagnoses. Massive problem. But these physical health things, there is no pathway. There are no guidelines. I mean, the state of affairs with ADHD and autism is really not great, but at least people are gradually, recognizing them. Don't need to get into the overdiagnosis debate, but, there are nice guidelines, there are policies, there are services. Whereas the real problem for hypermobility, even for adults, is that there just isn't a joined up service. There aren't clear guidelines. This is where the EDS toolkit is very helpful, but I was just talking in supervision with my PhD student, Sarah Clark, and she was talking, a patient had talked about the serendipity in her research, in the journey of finding someone who knew what you were on about. And that is just so hard.
Yeah. So what kind of, if there isn't yet that, and you mentioned obviously the toolkits, and we can link those absolutely in the show notes to give parents some support, step in the right direction. But if it's not yet kind of joined up as such, from a hypermobility perspective, what kind of support or adjustments would you recommend that make the biggest difference for neurodivergent children?
I think it's a bit like, and these can be made without necessarily a diagnosis, is the idea of sort of energy accounting. So don't, be doing so many things and getting into boom bust cycles. Make sure if you're prone to having ankle problems, I think arch supports are really helpful, possibly. And also, supportive footwear, very important. Electrolytes, obviously consideration about childhood doses and things, which I'm not an expert in, but boosting your blood volume through things like electrolytes before standing, and trying to avoid a triple whammy. So don't be standing in the hot sun, for example, whilst you're wearing far too hot or tight or clothes that are itchy or something. So you may have to do one of these things: be in a hot environment or stand, but try not to do both together.
Oh my gosh, so interesting.
Also, I must caveat, hypermobility is a controversial thing in children because a lot of children are naturally more flexible when they're younger, and the whole puberty thing sort of changes things. And you must, not all children who are flexible when they're 2 or 3 are going to necessarily remain so as adults. But there are these signs and markers. And also, it isn't just hypermobile neurodivergent children may struggle at school, particularly in schools that are not designed well for them, or not, universally designed. But this combination of hypermobility and neurodivergence can, in fact, in certain circumstances, be really helpful. So Simone Biles, gymnast in a class of her own, ADHD and hypermobile. Michael Phelps, ADHD and hypermobile. I am sure that almost all people who are singers, or, you kind of need bendy vocal cords to have that sort of range. The fingers that we talked about, pretty essential for most musical instruments. I have a collaboration with the film director, Nigel Cole. We looked at, he was interested in whether there were many people in the kind of creative industries who were hypermobile and neurodivergent. We found that being hypermobile predicted being more likely to be creative because of neurodivergent traits. So it's about supporting children to overcome challenges and also help them thrive in the things that are interesting and stimulating, but not to be overstimulated and not to be understimulated.
Yes, here, that's good advice. It's a balance, isn't it? Particularly if you've got kids that can't sit still, using your sport examples there. But yes, trying to help them find the things that they're interested in, and then where their natural talent lies as well, and being able to develop that. It's an awful thing to say, but it feels like we have to get our kids to survive school these days, which is a completely different conversation. But yeah, as you say, it can be a real benefit at the other side of this. So just on a final note then, what message would you like to leave kind of parents listening to help them on this ADHD journey? Because particularly as they're starting, and they might be listening to this as I have and thought, oh my gosh, this is so interesting, and starting to understand the role that hypermobility might also be playing for their children.
So I think it's about embracing everybody and every mind. It's about, I remember following an account, NeuroWild, saying, having a neurodivergence assessment for a child is like trying to find out what kind of plant they are. Some of them need more water, some of them need less, some of them need more light, some of them need less. But it's not just about neurodivergence, it's about the whole body. And unfortunately, we need to equip ourselves with resources. So please do look at the EDS GP toolkit, the EDS school toolkit, my Linktree, Bendy Brain, and do follow and subscribe and share the Bendy Brain YouTube channel. And do check out the resources at SEDS Connective from Jane Green.
Thank you, Jessica. We will link all of those in the show notes because I think they'll be really valuable resources. But thank you so much for joining us today. It's just been the most fascinating conversation, genuinely.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at allaboardadhd. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.